Good morning, brethren. Happy Sabbath to you all. I hope you're having a lovely morning so far. And good morning to everyone who's also joined in with us on Zoom. Now, the last couple of times I've been up here, we've explored all over the land of Israel, with the exception of its great capital city, Jerusalem, which I'd like to share with you today. Now, today, Jerusalem, if the West Bank, eastern part of it is included, is Israel's largest city with a population of about 600,000. Now, it is spread out much further than its ancient city walls. Its inner heart, though, is the walled Old City. Now, the Old City is split into four quarters apart from the Temple Mount, and the walls of today's Old City were built by the Ottoman Turks in the 1500s, so a much longer time after since the birth of Christ. Now, to the south of the Temple Mountain, currently outside of the city walls of the Old City, is the city of David. Now, this is the original city before the city grew north to surround the Temple Mountain and then expanded further west in Hezekiah's time. Now, to the south of the city of David is the Valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna, and on its eastern side is the Kidron Valley, and also opposite of the Kidron Valley is the Mount of Olives and the Mount of Offence. Now, the city of David is the site of the original city that David conquered. Now, it is actually situated on a spur that slopes downhill south from the Temple Mount. Now, the reason that it was chosen was because it had cliffs on three sides and it had a water source with the Gihon Spring. Now, it was surrounded by the Kidron Valley on its east, Tyropoeon Valley on the left, and the Valley of Hinnom on its south side. Now, in the 1990s, it was also discovered that there was an extension of the city walls that protruded out east into the Kidron Valley to enclose and protect the Gihon Spring, which was the city's water source. Now, Jerusalem's main defensive vulnerability was from the north, but a new archaeological finding has uncovered an additional defensive feature that directly addressed that vulnerability on its northern side. Now, evidence was uncovered of a moat across the northern part of the ridge just to the north of the stone step structure where the original city walls of Jebus were located. Now, while it has a degree of elevation above the valleys on each side of it, the city of David is surrounded by higher hills all around it. Now, on its north side is Mount Moriah, where the temple was. Across the Kidron Valley on its east is the Mount of Olives. On its western side is the Western Hill, where the upper room is today. And this feature of Jerusalem being surrounded by higher hills is drawn on in one of the Psalms of Ascent, in Psalm 125, verse 2, where we read, "As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forever." Now, when David came to conquer the Jebusite city of David, he had some intel that he thought would be helpful with regards to the conquest. Now, he knew about a water shaft that gave access to the city. Now, since the Gihon Spring was surrounded by the city's walls, this water shaft had to be the Canaanite tunnel that went from the spring and then under the walls and then underneath the Kidron Valley. Now, this would have been a very tough challenge for Joab, as this is quite a narrow tunnel, as shown on the right, where a few of our tour group went through part of it. And because it is the only way under the walls, it is a natural place that you would guard well. Now, David, Joab, and their troops conquered the city, including the Jebusite fortress, which was called Zion, which means the highest or heavenly. Now, near the top of the eastern slope of the city of David, Kathleen Kenyon in the 1960s, after her excavations at Jericho, discovered an enormous stepstone structure shown here, which would be later determined to be a massive retaining wall for a monumental structure at the top of it. Now, that property at the top of this photo here is what it looked like in the 1990s. And that property was then bought out And Elat Mazar in 2005 uncovered a monumental structure which she believed was David's palace. Now notice the building at the bottom of that retaining wall. Now inscriptional evidence pointed to belonging to a man named Ahiel, later around the time of Hezekiah. Now if David's palace was at the top of that stone step retaining wall, you could sort of imagine Uriah and Bathsheba's house perhaps being in the same location as that house at the bottom there, where David could look down on its rooftop where Bathsheba would have been bathing. Now underneath the visitor centre and at the top of the stone step structure is this monumental building uncovered in 2005, which Elat Mazar believes is King David's palace. Now the main palace of the kings that followed David was the later palace that Solomon built a little further up the hill towards the Temple Mount. Now this building, however, would have then continued as either a secondary palace or a royal governmental building under later kings. Now 2 burnt stamp seals called bullae with the names of Jeremiah's scribe Baruch and Jerahmeel, the king's son, both noted in Jeremiah 36, were actually found in this building, indicated it still served as a governmental building after Solomon had built his palace higher up. Now this is what the stone step retaining wall of the palace looks like today. Now between the top of the wall and the flowers in the top left photo is the palace. Now above it is the visitor centre to the city of David, and above that, would you believe, they're actually building a restaurant above David's palace, which may already be finished by now. And just to blow you away, here is David's palace as it might have looked like being projected onto the retaining wall of David's palace during the sound and light show that they have there regularly. And here's a few more photos from the sound and light show at the City of David, which was really one of my very favourite highlights from the whole tour that we did. Now here's a few more photos from the City of David Archaeological Park. Now the Israelis have taken a lot of pride in the City of David, and they've done this wonderful job of making it as attractive as possible with flowers and greenery. Now within the protection of these Canaanite spring tower walls was a pool 10 by 14 metres that was cut by the Canaanites into the bedrock and fed from the waters of the Gihon spring. Now this pool was likely the site of the coronation of King Solomon, which we read about in 1 Kings 1, where Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet took Solomon to the Gihon spring and anointed him as king. Now Zadok the priest is actually the title of the British coronation theme that Handel wrote for the coronation of King George II in 1727, which has been played at every coronation since, including the most recent coronation of King Charles III. Now, anticipating a coming Assyrian invasion, Hezekiah fortified Jerusalem and constructed a tunnel from the Gihon spring to the Siloam pool, blocking the old Canaanite watercourse in order to prevent the waters of Gihon to be used by their enemies. Now, the Hezekiah's tunnel is still functioning today, feeding the pool, and it's the big touristy thing to do when you're there in Jerusalem, is to walk the entire length of the Hezekiah's tunnel, which is about 533 metres or half a kilometre long. Now there's a little pool that dates from the Byzantine period where you come out at Hezekiah's tunnel. Now, it was assumed by many to have been the original location of the pool of Siloam, but the original pool was then rediscovered a short walk away during excavation work for Assyria in 2004. Now, as you can see here, one of the 4 sides was fully excavated, as well as 2 corners at each end. Now, there was this big grove of trees which covered where the rest of the pool probably would have been. Now, this property was eventually acquired and excavation started on the pool very soon after our trip there a couple of years ago. Now, they were able to find some more steps below the previous steps uncovered, but as you can see from this photo, it appears that the steps of the other 3 sides had been broken up over the previous centuries. Now, the illustrations at the bottom here showed how it might have looked during biblical times. Now, the Pool of Siloam was where water would be collected by the priests and then taken up during the great water ceremony that was held on the seventh day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And it was also here where Jesus healed a blind man in John chapter 9, a miracle which was most likely held on the 8th day Holy Day festival. Now, in addition to Hezekiah's tunnel, Hezekiah expanded the city's walls, including a double second wall on its eastern side. Now, Jeff Robertson and our tour leader, Joe Ross, participated in an Ambassador College dig there back in 1985, and our trip was the first time that both of them had actually gone back to the site together. Now, Hezekiah expanded the city wall, enclosed the Pool of Siloam and most of the western hill. Now, the reason for this was that there was many refugees living there on the western hill who had fled from the northern kingdom after the Assyrians had conquered their land. Now, a recent discovery in the city of David is the Pilgrim Road, or Step Street, as it's known as, which is an early Roman period street connecting the Temple Mount from its southwestern corner to the Pool of Siloam. Now, it was used by ritual processions ascending from the pool to the temple, and it was constructed around the 30s AD. Now, there would have been shops on either side of this road that pilgrims would take after they'd cleaned themselves at the pool and then went up to the temple. Now, when we were there in 2023, there was only a very small part of the road near the Pool of Siloam that was open up to visitors. Now, directly underneath the Pilgrim Street is a narrow drainage or sewer channel that we climbed the whole length of right up to the temple. Now, those of our group who were quite tall found the going quite tough, as it's only about 5 feet high all the way through. Now, during the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, some 3,000 people hid in that drainage channel. Now, when the Romans found out, they'd break through the street stones down to the channel and brutally kill them all. Now, just south of the temple is an area referred to in the Bible as the Ophel. Now, it's a word that means bulge, and it seems to have been the equivalent of the Greek word Acropolis, meaning the higher upper city where royalty would live. Now, 2 burnt clay stamp seals were found in this royal precinct just south of the temple with the names of Isaiah and Hezekiah, implying, along with other artifacts, that the royal palace was close by. And it's likely that this is where Solomon's royal palace and his other buildings were located, though those remains have yet to be uncovered. Now, the standard view of where the temple stood is where the Dome of the Rock is today, in the middle of the Temple Mount, and that all of the today's Temple Mount was a part of the temple. Now, it is clear that the temple was built somewhere on the Temple Mount, as 2 Chronicles 3:1 plainly states it was built on Mount Moriah, not the city of David as proposed by some people. Now, in most illustrations of the Roman Fort Antonia, north of the temple, it is usually shown as a rather small building. Now, Josephus, however, described it as having the largeness and form of a palace with broad camp spaces for camps, and it was like a city in size. Now, the inner citadel may have been small as imagined by most archaeologists, but attached to it would have been barracks with all kinds of facilities for the soldiers that occupied considerable room. Now, the top 2 illustrations show how Norma Robertson envisions the Temple Mount and Fort Antonio. Now, she has the temple close to today's Al-Aqsa Mosque in the southern half of the Temple Mount, and Fort Antonio occupying the northern half of the Temple Mount with its tower and large barracks. Now, the major point supporting a southern placement of the Temple Mount for the temple is where the ancient aqueduct flowed, which brought in spring water from the Etham Spring near Bethlehem. Now, a great abundance of water was vital for ritual purification and cleansing of all the altars from the blood from the sacrifices. Now, this water had to be running or living water, not still water from cisterns. Now, no water channels whatsoever go where the central and northern placements of the temple are. Now, the ancient aqueduct and the channels that branch off it on the Temple Mount are shown in blue, which comes from a map based on Charles Warren's survey. Now, the Jewish Mishnah states that the priest's court was cleansed by the water from the aqueduct. It was the water from the aqueduct, not one of the cisterns, which cleansed the temple. And the aqueduct goes absolutely nowhere near where the Dome of the Rock is today. Now, the map on the left here shows Norma Robinson's view of the original Temple of Solomon in green and the expanded temple that Herod built in navy blue. Now, in the photo on the right is the southern end of the Temple Mount showing the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, I've been superimposed in blue there where she places the building of the holy place with the Holy of Holies at the back of it where the Ark would have rested. Now, when our 2023 tour group went to the Temple Mount, we naturally had to take the mandatory group photo in front of the Dome of the Rock. So, if the temple was on the Temple Mount as conventionally believed, how could the Jews build an end-time temple as prophesied if they can't even pray on the Temple Mount, let alone build anything on the Temple Mount? Well, my own speculation is to resolve this dilemma is that the possible discovery of the Ark of the Covenant may possibly be the key. Now, how would the Jews respond to its discovery? Would they not feel the need to build a tabernacle to house it? And if they have a tabernacle with the Ark in it, wouldn't they feel that they would be free then to offer sacrifices again, even if it is not on the Temple Mount? Now, the traditional location of the house of the high priest Caiaphas is at a church on the lower slope of the Western Hills south of the old city walls. Now, it is called Church of St. Peter at Gallicantu, a word that means the cock crows. Now, the statue in the middle of the top row commemorates that haunting incident of Peter denying Christ 3 times. Now, one very cool feature at this location is it's got ancient steps in its grounds that date to Roman times. And it's quite likely that Jesus possibly walked down them on his way from the upper room to the Mount of Olives, or was brought up them if this is the correct location for Caiaphas' house. Now, Philo and Josephus indicate that Herod's palace was the residence or praetorium of the Roman governors when they were present in Jerusalem. Now, during the 1970s, just outside the western city walls, adjacent to where Herod's palace was, an elevated bima, or judgment seat, was found outside a hidden gate that gave Herod quick access out of the city from the palace. Now, Herod's palace had 2 buildings at either end, with a colonnaded courtyard in between. Now, when Herod Antipas from Galilee was visiting, and Jesus was bounced back and forth between Pilate and Herod, and they were in the 2 buildings opposite of each other here in the palace. And the scourging probably took place in the soldiers' barracks within the palace. Now, where Jesus was tried openly in front of the crowd, the scene would probably look like this illustration on the right-hand side here, with Pilate on the elevated judgment seat on the outside of the walls close to the hidden gate with stairs in front of it. Now, the traditional Catholic and Orthodox side of the crucifixion and burial of Jesus is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which lies west of where the temple was. Now, today, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is within the walls of the old city in the Christian Quarter. However, back in Jesus' time, it was actually laid just outside of the city walls. Now, notice in the map at the top the location of the Garden Tomb, which also lies outside of the city walls, just north of the Damascus Gate. Now, the site that is considered by many Protestants to be the site of the burial and resurrection is the Garden Tomb. Now, the Garden Tomb is adjacent to a rocky escarpment, which since the mid-19th century has been proposed by some scholars to be Golgotha, where the crucifixion took place, because of the holes that appear to look like a face. Now, the organisation maintaining the Garden Tomb refrains from claiming that this is the authentic tomb of Jesus. Now, that said, it is a beautiful location with lovely gardens and an authentic appearance to reflect on the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, regardless of whether it is the true site or not. Now, there is a third, lesser known possibility for where Christ was crucified, based on some overlooked clues in the Bible. The Apostle Paul in Hebrews 13 actually gives us a couple of geographical clues for the crucifixion that connects with the symbolism of the temple. The Apostle Paul tells us that Jesus was crucified both outside the gate and outside the camp, referring to a certain distance away. Now, the altar here that Paul speaks of, that we have as Christians, is the sin offering altar. Now, Paul says that the priest could not eat of those sacrifices, which is true of the sin offerings, and the place where sin offerings were burnt was not in the temple, but outside the city and outside the camp. And he very strongly implies that Jesus was crucified near this altar. Now, the Church of the Pater Noster commemorates where it is traditionally believed that Jesus taught his disciples to pray, and some say that this is where he gave his end-time Olivet prophecy recorded in Matthew 24. Now, Norman Robinson, who places the temple in the southern part of the Temple Mount, shows in the Google map view here on the right, 2,000 cubits due east of where she places the temple leads to the olive grove of the Church of the Pater Noster. Now, the large Jewish cemetery and the tomb of Zechariah are due east of where she places the temple, not east of the Dome of the Rock. Now, in Genesis 22, verse 2, you might remember when Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac, he was told to go to the land of Moriah, not Mount Moriah. Now, it is usually assumed that the mountain in the land of Moriah was where the Temple Mount is today. But since Abraham offering up Isaac was a type of God the Father offering up his only son Jesus, Abraham offering Isaac may have happened where Jesus himself was killed. Now, adding further support to that view, the Jews plainly state that the sin offering altar in Jerusalem, where the red heifer was also burnt, was to the east of the temple on the Mount of Olives. Now, it's quite likely that the Garden of Gethsemane was near the Church of All Nations at the base of the Mount of Olives, though the olive grove in the Pater Noster Church is also a possibility. Now, we read in Zechariah 14, which says that the Lord will stand on the Mount of Olives when he returns to take over and rule the world, and the mountain will split in two, with one half shifting north and one half shifting south. Now, one fact that most people don't know is that the Mount of Olives is actually a double mountain. It has a lesser peak to the southeast of it. Now, in between the two peaks is the little town of Bethphage, which means house of unripe figs. And it was the likely site of where Jesus cursed the fig tree. Now, Bethany was further southeast on the opposite side of the lesser peak, and was Jesus' base when he visited Jerusalem, where his friends Mary, Martha and Lazarus, who he later raised from the dead, lived. Now, there's a local tomb there which also claims to be where Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Now, it should be noted in Luke 24:50, it clearly states that the ascension of Jesus was not on the main peak of the Mount of Olives, but actually at Bethany on its lesser peak. Now, the current old city walls today were built around 1540 by the Ottoman Turks under Suleiman the Magnificent. Now, Jerusalem's old city is about 1 square kilometre in area, and each side, most of which can be walked, is about 1 kilometre in length. Now, there's this wonderful charm about the old city of Jerusalem with its cobbled streets and shops. And a few kilometres west of the old city is the Israel Museum, and within its grounds is the large-scale model of the first century Jerusalem, which is a highly recommended place to visit if you're in Jerusalem. Now, I could certainly go on covering much more about Jerusalem, but it's now time to finish off our brief look at Israel's great capital city of Jerusalem. Now, if all goes well here, I might be back in about 3 weeks' time to cover the last part of this mini-series on the Holy Land, as we look at Jordan and its many sites of natural beauty and biblical interest. Thank you.